I'm Steve Smith, and welcome to the Lucky or Good podcast. Our podcast invites reflection and dialogue following outdoor and experiential education incidents and near misses. Why do we normally succeed, but sometimes fail? What can we learn from these experiences? Through non-judgmental analysis, we uncover lessons for outdoor and experiential education programs. Rather than blaming and shaming, we try to see things from our guests' perspective, asking different questions. What went well? How did their actions make sense to them at the time? And what can we learn from this for the future? We also invite our listeners to imagine themselves in our guest situation and to explore the sometimes fine line between lucky and good. I am very excited and grateful to welcome today's guest, Deb Ajango, an award-winning researcher, author, and instructor of risk management and wilderness medicine. Through her 2 books, her accreditation work for outdoor and experiential education programs, and the work she does at Safety Ed, Deb has enriched risk management skills and practices for countless people over decades. I know that a huge amount of my early learning came from reading and rereading Deb's work, then getting to know her as a colleague and a friend. No one has more insightful lessons to share from their stories than this episode's guest, Deb Ajango. Welcome, Deb. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Steve. Quite an introduction.
So you have a story to share with our listeners today.
I do. Based on your theme, I chose an incident that occurred a few years ago with a middle school. I'll call Emory. So 6th, 7th, and 8th grade girls and boys. So for the listeners or viewers, this was in the lower 48, so Colorado area. The school was, their mission included experiential education, so that they embraced it. That was very clear on their website. The parents were very much into it. They very commonly attended trips, outdoor education trips. And so this school several years ago had started a tradition of having a winter trip where they hiked into a fairly large, they called it a hut in the Colorado mountains. And when you see this thing, it's actually not a hut. I would call it a very nice lodge. It didn't have plumbing or electricity, but it had a generator. So it did have the ability to have lights, heat, and cooking, lots of space. The school group would go in the winter for about a 4-day trip. They'd stay at the hut for the 4 days, come back out. They had an outdoor education instructor, an assistant, and then other teachers and parents. So they had multiple chaperones, adult chaperones, about 15, 16 kids, girls and boys. The originator of this tradition, this activity, had taken a NOLS course and an Outward Bound course. So she actually was relatively skilled in her backcountry skill sets. She had taken a level 1 avalanche course. She knew how to build snow shelters. And so all of this was taken into account when they came up with the original curricula. She broached the subject with the principal, with the other teachers. They thought this sounded awesome. So they started this tradition again of drive to the mountains. The field would be academic and curricula, which would include avalanche education, snow shelter building, and fire building. And that all the kids would do kind of a round robin and do each of those skills each day. First couple years, no problem, went great. Again, are we good or are we lucky? It seemed like things were going well. Ultimately, the first instructor, Anne, moved on. Her mentee, Helen, who had no traditional outdoor education, who had learned everything from Anne, her mentor, she continued this tradition, and the only modifications were incremental. One included that she started to build those shelters that they used were quinzhees, which I'll talk about in a second. And so an example of an incremental change is that initially they were a 2-person quinzhee, and then over a couple of years it became a 3-person quinzhee, and then it became a 4-person quinzhee. So again, that would be an example. This particular year, Helen was in charge. She had an assistant who was pretty new to the outdoor education world. There were maybe 3 or 4 other adults, another teacher, and then some parents. A group of kids drive to the trailhead. They all hike in. Day 1 goes fine. On day 2, they're building a quinzhee. So the audience kind of has to understand what that is. If you just take a whole bunch of snow and you put a big pile of snow and you pound on it, it's very much what your big snow removal machine in a city is going to do in a cul-de-sac. And then if you let it sit there for a while, it centers and solidifies, becomes super solid. And then you can actually hollow it out. So you can do this in the field to make a really quick snow shelter. So this is what the group was doing. And actually, I think on day one, the first day full field, the boys did a quinzhee, worked no problem. The next day, the girls are going to do a quinzhee. They had been allowed to sleep in the quinzhees through the years, and they loved it. So they really, really pushed Helen to make a 6-person quinzhee so that 6 of the girls could sleep in the quinzhee. And she allowed it. She talked to the other parents, the other adults. Everybody said this sounded okay. So they built a 6-person quinzhee. This was in the morning. They went inside, had lunch, came out in the afternoon. They had allowed it to center. It helps to know that the snow was very, very dry and old. So it was not good for sintering. Generally, you're going to have to leave it a long time to solidify. And they left it for really only a couple hours over lunch. So now they came out, and now you've got a big mound of snow, and now you have to start by hollowing out a door. Once that gets hollowed out, you have a little scoop in there. Somebody lays on their back. They start hollowing out more. The first part's pretty slow moving, but after a few minutes, you can get somebody fully inside. Next thing you know, 2 or 3 people can be inside, 4 people can be inside. So now you have to imagine the people inside are on their back with their hands above their face, and they're using a shovel to try to dig out, hollow the quinzhee above their head. The group heard a sound, just a thump, something, and the entire quinzhee had collapsed. So the whole thing had come down on top of all the people inside, smothering them, right? So initially, people are wondering what just happened, and when they see the fracture lines, it's really very much of an avalanche burial with all the trauma, right? Nobody inside the quinzhee is able to breathe. Their arms get pushed back. They have a big block of snow on their chest wall. They can't breathe. There are many people standing around who realize this, and they go frantic. People are throwing blocks aside, grabbing ankles, pulling people from the debris, but nobody has a head count. They don't know how many people are inside the shelter. And now they're walking on top of the debris, trying to find people inside. Ultimately, a couple of the injuries occurred because the rescuers were walking on top of the debris, stepping on the victims. It took about 2 minutes, and they thought they got everybody. They do a head count. One of the adults says, "My daughter's still missing." So she was inside the quinzhee. She's still in the debris. 1 more minute passes. They find her ankle, her body, her face. They clear the snow from her face. She is not breathing, and she is unresponsive. It has been maybe 3 or 4 minutes, according to the people I interviewed, right? So it's not been a huge amount of time. But this young woman, call her Mandy, she is turning colors, right? Kind of an ashen grayish, bluish, not breathing. Helen very quickly clears snow, head tilt, chin lift, gives her 2 slow breaths, appropriate rescue breathing. It triggers her breathing response. Andy starts coughing, wakes up, rolls over, becomes back to alert and oriented. The whole chaos kind of settles down. Now everybody's heard of it. All the boys come over. Everybody comes. So now the whole group is standing around. Ultimately, there are 2 patients or victims. Mandy was the one who had rescue breathing. She actually has recovered. She's alert and oriented. She was very frightened. Her mom was frightened. The connection between the 2 created a lot of stress. The assistant teacher had twisted her ankle during the whole rescue, and that was it. So there are 2 people who are now injured. It's late in the day. It's got to be past 4 o'clock. It's going to get dark at about 6 or 7. They haven't packed anything. They still have 1 day. They're supposed to go out the next day. Now they have to make a decision. What do we do with this? So now the crisis has already happened. It's not, as far as they could tell, it's not a huge deal. But they had to make a decision. Do we go out tonight or do we spend the night here? So they basically took a little time. The whole team did kind of a group decision making, took them into the hut, the lodge. They did a deep, entire group discussion on this, and they decided to spend the night there. I don't think Everybody had like headlamps. Maybe some people had flashlights, but it would be difficult to go out in the dark. They looked at the pros and the cons. They asked Mandy and Mandy's mom. Both Mandy and Mandy's mom said, yes, we would be willing to stay. I think everything's fine. One of the parents, the chaperones, did not agree with this decision. Instead of being honest, she decided to take the situation into her own hands. She climbed out onto the roof. She got on went upstairs, got in like a balcony. She had a cell phone. And actually, something the team needs or the listeners need to know is the team had a sat phone, but the battery was dead. They're out of cell phone service. They have no way to communicate what's going on. So that had to come into your decision making. They weren't able to call out. They weren't able to call for help. They were all on their own. So this lady decides she's going to call her boyfriend, who's an EMT, and she's going to tell him what's happened and ask him, do you think we should send in a rescue? Is there any way you can get a helicopter to come in tonight? So she's hanging off the roof with like 1 or 2 bars describing this, and I interviewed her, and she told me how this poor girl hadn't been breathing, so she should be evacuated. But it was a really poor cell phone call, sketchy information. The calls dropped. A helicopter never arrives that night. So now we'll just fast forward to the next day, next morning. The group actually did, and I should even say the night before, they did a group debrief. According to the group, including the kids and the parents, Helen did a very good job with a group debrief. The group was getting along quite well. Mandy did not have any type of like post-traumatic stress. They were laughing, they were giggling, they had hot chocolate. The next morning, they had a really fun breakfast. Then I interviewed the kids. They thought this was fun, and they weren't sure if Mandy or the teacher should hike out. They just didn't know. So they thought it would be really fun to set up a sled and basically do like a drag. And they were laughing, and at times they tipped them over. So that all went well. They got back to the school thinking that it wasn't that big of a deal. In the meantime, the boyfriend had spread the word throughout the community. Everybody knew, the parents knew, the principal learned from one of the parents. So all of the parents and the principal are waiting at the parking lot, and rumors are now rampant about all of the mistakes that have been made and all the things that did or didn't happen. And the teachers, the parents, and the kids were quite surprised when they showed up to chaos. So that's the story. The parents were very, very upset at what had happened. They crucified Helen. They crucified the school and the principal. They demanded all of these people be fired, that they close down the outdoor program. And ultimately, they asked that I and another person come in and do an incident review.
Thank you for that amazing story. And that's really quite vivid. And I can imagine it, from the perspective of the trip leader and then the parents and the students and then the folks getting this frantic call back in the office. And it's easy to imagine this story from all those different perspectives. What would be some takeaways for you in terms of the things that you would offer as lessons learned from this incident?
And just to start, we usually start with the question of your mission is why are you doing this in the first place, right? Like why does it make sense that you're willing to, and I'm going to use terms that are intentionally provocative, but impose risk on these students, right? And of course, risk, as you know, is just the potential for harm. Why are you willing to expose these minors, 12, 13-year-old kids to the potential for harm? What justifies that? And if you can say, well, because here's how we're going to manage the risk, right? We believe we can manage it into an acceptable risk tolerance level within our mission. And here are the benefits. Well, then it makes sense, right? Have you gone through that process? In the initial quinzhee that they had built, a 2-person, very small quinzhee, very low risk with a qualified instructor, that all made sense. I buy that when you first started doing this, it made sense for you to be able to do this. So the initial concept of going into the mountains and building this quinzhee was not the problem itself, okay? However, they enlarged the risk over time, right? So they had 2 things were going on at once. One was the attrition of the skill set of the leader. The first leader had actually taken an outward bound course, taken a nose course. She had done enough where her level of understanding was deeper. Her breadth and depth of knowledge was deeper. But when she She took her knowledge and passed it to Helen, who was the next instructor. And it was a very informal mentorship, right? Which is extremely common in our industry, right? We don't have a very formal way of teaching people, and there's very little testing that's done, right? So, like if I'm going to teach you the woofer skills, I have to test you to make sure you know those skills. I have to put you under pressure, give you a physical test, a paper test, and we don't ever do that really. Very few programs do that. When you have a mentor teaching a mentee, it's more like, hey, watch me and see what I do. And that's how Helen got trained. So there was attrition of that skill set over time, and that wasn't caught within the organization. The organization didn't realize that was happening. So there was attrition of leadership, which led to really, to me, the next big problem, and this was much more of an organizational problem, is the organization really didn't have a risk management system, right? They hired one person, Helen, and they said, Helen seems to know a lot about the outdoors. Let's have her run this outdoor program. And once again, as you know, that's really common in our industry. And it's like, wow, that's putting all of your eggs in one basket, right? Now, Helen is responsible for all of this risk management. All of this weight is on her shoulders, but there's nobody to help her because she doesn't even have a teacher that can tell her what she doesn't know, right? She doesn't know what she doesn't know. It's very difficult for a beginner to evaluate, to self-evaluate, right? So when we have beginners, like no matter what you are teaching, if it's self-arrest or knots or wilderness medicine, if we have a group of beginners and say, go ahead and do an evaluation of yourselves, research has basically shown that that's almost a waste of time. If you don't have that vetting process within your outdoor program, nobody can say whether or not Helen was good enough. So the organization didn't know, what does a good instructor look like? What does a good trip look like? What does any good thing look like when it comes to risk management? They didn't have a risk management committee. They didn't have anybody within the organization that had knowledge to evaluate Helen. They just hired Helen and let Helen do her thing, and she had minimal training. So people will often point at Helen and say she is the problem. She was not qualified. She shouldn't have been there. But if you really take a step back, well, the school totally set her up, right? The school allowed Helen to go out there, and Helen didn't know what Helen didn't know. And so it's very unfair. So Helen enlarged the risk, right? So the school had never really had a talk on risk tolerance. How much is too much risk? Like, how much risk are we willing to allow in order to achieve our mission, which is to teach these skills? They didn't ever really have that conversation, at least not that bluntly. And over time, Helen allowed a larger quinzhee to be built, and to back Helen up, the assistant instructor did, all the parents did, all the kids did. Nobody saw a problem of enlarging this quinzhee over time. And so the whole thing collapsed because of the lack of that knowledge, that depth of knowledge. It wasn't just Helen's fault, but that is what happened. So they enlarged the risk unnecessarily.
And if I could highlight one little nuance there, when you first started talking about this change from 2 people to 3 people to 4, I think you really aptly described it as incremental change.
Mm-hmm.
And it was slow, and it was over time, and we normalized these small changes, these small adjustments that no single change seemed like a big deal at the time. And in fact, going from 5 people to 6 maybe isn't really that different, right? But really what they did was they went from 2 to 6. They just did it gradually over time, right? And for me, it brings up just this concept of drifting into failure and these small incremental adjustments that an organization might make, not just in their quinzhees, but maybe, let's say, in their group sizes or ratios or populations or activities, or how the equipment that they use might just gradually shift and adjust and drift over time.
The other way around is that it doesn't gradually shift, but everything around them does.
There you go.
So another example is a program I'm working with. They're basically running the program the same way they did 20 years ago, but everything around them has incrementally changed. And so their clientele is no longer, they don't have the same background as the kids 20 years ago did. They're afraid of the outdoors. They're basically addicted to the, phones now. And the trip leaders didn't have the same skill set. And so their justification is, we're doing we're doing it the same way. And you used to say we were good. And it's like, well, because everything around you has changed. But just as I totally agree is that when the change is incremental, if it's happening to us, we don't tend to see it.
Yeah, so this idea of drifting into failure and those incremental small little changes, for me, I think about the normalization of deviance with the Space Shuttle Challenger story and how they had gradually over time accepted more and more and more risk as they felt pressure to launch. And there was no morning where they woke up and said, today is the day that we're going to have an explosion. It was just this small, gradual drift into that more hazardous place that they didn't recognize until it was too late. Are there any other lessons learned there that you'd like to highlight?
The last one had to do with the lack of an emergency action plan. I mean, they virtually did not have one. They had something at school that had to do with the school, like a school shooting or whatever. Here's what we would do if this happens. But they didn't really have anything that applied to the outdoors because that wasn't their primary. That's not what they usually did, right? That wasn't a day to day. So they didn't have a specific emergency action plan to the outdoors. It was more or less, hey, these folks have good heads on their shoulders. They're mature adults. They'll figure it out, which again, I've seen that a lot. I'm sure you have. It's like, ooh, when the brain's under pressure, it's really helpful to have this simple bullet point list, not a book to read, but what do you want them to do?
I can imagine some of the folks back in town who had gotten this, report about this tragic thing that had occurred and reacted emotionally to what they were imagining went down in the field. And I could imagine one of those people saying something like, well, Helen clearly needs to be fired for her negligent and careless approach to safety. She clearly has no skills and experience and not the right fit for the role that she's in. And let's start by firing Helen and then figuring out how to keep this from happening again. What would you say to folks who were leaping to that way of analyzing this incident?
I think it's extremely common, right? And that's what's so frustrating. It's not fair. It's the person on the cutting edge, which would be the character of Helen. They might deserve to be fired. It depends on how egregious their mistake was. When I look at Helen's mistakes, I don't think they were particularly egregious. Like you said, they were incremental. She briefed and debriefed the principal every single year, right? I mean, I think the word had gotten out that this quinzhee was getting bigger over time. Other people could have said something. They could have provided guidance, blah, 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 right? And it's like, yeah, Helen made a mistake, but everybody around her allowed it to happen, right? And so if you're going to take that route, well, again, it's going to happen again. If you get rid of Helen, you haven't gotten rid of a systemic problem. It's certainly foreseeable that the next Helen will make the same mistakes. So rather than pointing at Helen, how about if you look at the system? So, because that's not going to prevent something from happening in the future. How can we create a vetting system and checks and balances so that no matter who is in that position, let's just get rid of the names, that person, not your entire risk management system it should never be dependent on a single person. And that's what they had done, is they had created a system that was dependent on Helen, and all human beings will make a mistake. It's just that, as we all know, and I'm sure you put this many times in your book, it's just like for a lot of office people, that mistake might cause a jammed shredder. For our mistakes, it might cause a debilitating or fatal injury, right? So everybody is prone to mistakes. The best way to do it is figure out, well, how can we prevent those mistakes from happening?
So when I think back again to that concept of the incremental change over time, and I think about how risk can hide in our daily successes, it was because all the previous trips where the quinzhee didn't collapse, where they had normalized and sort of started to learn some of the wrong things. And in your story here, right? Like if they had gotten away with it with the 6-person quinzhee, or maybe if the collapse had happened and no one had lost consciousness, Do you think they would have learned anything? And what does this tell us? What would you advise organizations to do in terms of the importance of learning and debriefing, even when things seemingly go well?
Well, and I think that, I mean, what you just said is an excellent point. Is I think if Mandy had never required rescue breathing, I don't think this ever would have had a formal debrief like we did. I mean, just that's it. They might have even laughed at it, right? Everybody freaked out, and then they realize everybody's okay. They laugh, they have hot chocolate, and this, you and I aren't talking about it. But because they had had the close call, you know, that it was really the fact that she had lost consciousness and required rescue breathing that brought it to the forefront of everybody's attention. Whereas you and I, as risk managers, I might be more prone to say, well, regardless of whether or not Mandy lost consciousness, it was still a close call, right? If the quinzhee collapsed, you still should have evaluated what the heck just happened here, right?
So, one of the things that we like to talk about is the idea of not waiting for tragedies to occur or even near misses necessarily in order to learn. We should be learning all the time. And one of the ways that we like to foster that learning, even from the successful days, is by debriefing with this question of were we lucky or were we good? It's an easy way to enter into a discussion, to recognize the things that went well, but also to surface if there were surprises, if there were near misses, if there were times when we were getting lucky instead of using our systems, as you pointed out. So in this story, Deb, what would your succinct answer be to this question of were we lucky or were we good?
Well, it's not super succinct because it's both. They did some things quite well. I mean, the whole fact that they chose a relatively low, initially, a low risk venue with a lodge. So they had safety. Again, they're thinking about risk management. We've got this group of kids, teenagers, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. They thought about supervision. They thought about the teachers. They thought about, I mean, they thought through a lot of things. But then that was it. They didn't keep coming back to how about every single year, right? If we're going to do incremental changes, have we been gaining a pound each year? They didn't do that, right? So they just basically, once they came up with what they thought was a good plan, they just stayed with it. They did not make the appropriate changes that should have been made over time. So I think that that was probably, as far as were they good? They were good initially. They made some very good steps. Again, I go through it was in alignment with the risk mission, risk tolerance, supervision, quality curricula. But then over time, the attrition of the instructor, I don't think that the school and a lot of the industry understands that when you're especially if you're taking minors' well-being under our jurisdiction, right? We're going to be in charge of a minor, we're going to be responsible for their safety, that requires a specialized skill set. I think a lot of organizations are willing to do kind of a jury-rigged risk management system because they don't understand that the industry has matured quite a bit. I know we both do similar things in life, but I very commonly will I'll use the aviation industry as an example. Is that 30 years ago, the aviation industry, the pilots were offended by using checklists and bullet points and, going back and forth with a pilot and co-pilot. And today that is absolutely standard. I mean, they have a very specific risk management system, and they are very, very safe, generally speaking. We are moving in that direction, but a lot of organizations don't understand that the industry has matured enough. And I think in that response or that regard, that was a pretty big error on the school's part, is that they didn't know what good risk management system looked like. And so if you say, are we lucky or are we good? It's very hard to be good if you don't know what good looks like.
That's one of the things that you've done such a great job with in your career, is helping people understand how to be very precise and very specific and to know what is the bullseye, not close to the bullseye, but what is the bullseye for good. And that's one thing I've always taken away from your keynote speeches and your writing and your research. So in terms of the aviation world, the two examples you mentioned of checklists and crew resource management culture in the cockpit are both, in my mind, really interesting ways to sort of acknowledge the potential and the likelihood of human error and to be able to absorb it. So the checklist arises from mistakes that have been made in the past and helps people know what to do to either prevent them or react if there is some event happening. And then the crew resource management piece is also about creating human checks and balances and a culture of people speaking up so that there isn't one person making decisions for the whole group. And we've seen that echoed in the avalanche education world as well. The importance of hearing from everyone in the group, even if the leader might ultimately end up making the final decision, that groups who do that end up making better decisions. So that's just a really interesting reflection on that intentional sort of system that arises not from running away from the concept of human error, but by acknowledging that human error is normal and that we need to be able to work with it and manage the impact that it can have.
Yeah, and it only makes sense. And so it makes sense that we would look at other industries who have the same potential consequence of instructor error or employee error. The employee makes a mistake or the employee has to problem solve really quickly. What are ways in which we can teach better? What are training regimens that work better, like simulation in the aircraft industry? How can we learn from other industries? And of course, and I should even throw out military, right? It's like that. We learn a lot from the military. And if you're engaged in battle, that's very different than target shooting, right? So like the military started with what they call the STET training or the stress inoculation training of how do we actually teach better so that the person can perform under highly pressurized situations. And I think that that's something that the outdoor industry is starting to adopt.
Deb, well, thank you so much for that great analysis. And I want to give you the opportunity to offer one final bit of advice to folks like Helen who might find themselves perhaps a single person in a single role with a lot hanging on them, and they don't necessarily have a structure around them to provide the support that Helen needed in your story. So what would your advice be for someone out there who might be in that situation?
Sure. Well, there's a few things because I do think there are quite a few folks in that situation. Number one, of course, is they can buy your books. So I think that a lot of times they don't know what they don't know, right? So they need to figure out like what does good look like? And I am being sort of facetious, but basically get their hands on whatever they can, which would include your books on theory, education. One of the things that I've tried to help organizations understand is when you hire a risk manager, which basically was what Helen was, like that's a unique skill set. So you need to create something within the system to offer mentoring and professional development. Risk management committees can be very useful. They can be very helpful. I very commonly say, don't just use your risk management committee to like look at incidents and accidents. Because it's like, what if you have 2 a year? That's it. They can be used, especially if it's a diverse skill set. Like your risk management or your risk manager, in this case, Helen, she needs somebody to bounce ideas off of. What does good look like? How would somebody else do this? We never want to make risk management be a single person's responsibility. You need to have accountability. Helen needs to be accountable, but she needs assistance in developing that skill set. So again, theoretical books, classes, a risk management committee, going to the Wilderness Risk Management Conference, learning about other organizations within your area. Maybe you can go and visit them, do a site visit of their place. They can come and visit you, have an accreditation site visit. There are a variety of things that people can do, but they really do need to reach out to find out what does good look like? What does a good risk management system look like? Otherwise, I mean, you're totally on your own.
Well, Deb, I've learned a lot from you over the years about what good looks like in outdoor education and risk management. And I'm just really grateful for the stories you've shared and your wonderful analysis and the lessons learned and all of your books and your teachings, not just for me, but for our whole community over the years. So special thanks to Deb for being our guest today. And thanks to all of you for listening. And remember, despite the show's title, we can be lucky and good. But relying on luck is not a risk management strategy. So keep listening and asking humble questions so that we can learn to convert our luck into skill for the future. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, please check the show notes and learn more about how to be a guest at luckyergoodpodcast.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and consider sharing the link with your adventure buddies so they can be good and not just lucky. Thanks for being here.